Go ahead and start. I'm Reverend Bob Moore. I'm Executive Director of the Peace Action Education Fund, as well as the Coalition for Peace Action, both based here in Princeton, New Jersey. Just about 6 years ago, we began a national project under our umbrella and had a founding conference called for the Interfaith Network on Drone Warfare. We had about 150 people come to that from all over the country, even a few from abroad, so it greatly exceeded our expectations. Subsequent to that, we did a series of 6 regional conferences. We have had presences at the Ecumenical Advocacy Days, and we did a series of 5 videos, half-hour videos for people to do in educational programs in their faith community, grassroots faith community, regional faith communities, and so on. And then we culminated that just in September 2019 with an organizer conference that about 80 people from across the country came to. And those 80 people spent a weekend together, also at Princeton Seminary. And we decided to meet monthly and started to do so to support each other and inform each other on what we were doing to expand the education and our base of support on this issue in the faith community. We met for, I guess, 5 months after that, November of 2019 through March of 2020. And after COVID emerged, we suspended that, and we're hopefully restarting it today. We're at least going to get more informed ourselves, but today's program is going to consist of hearing from Kathy Kelly. As we prepare to listen to her talk momentarily, I urge you to open your chat box if you haven't already. Kathy has helpfully posted some links to the things that she's going to be referencing. And once Kathy finishes her talk of up to a half hour, we'll spend 10 or 15 minutes in Q&A with her. When we get to that, we're going to be using the chat box for you to post your questions. When we finish that Q&A period, we will have about a 15-minute sort of touching base kind of meeting to see what's been happening in your organizing and in your area. So stay for that. Matt Hawthorne of the National Religious Campaign Against Torture, who chairs the Interfaith Working Group on Drone Warfare. That's a sister DC-based group to us that focuses on advocacy work right there in DC. So Matt will be giving us an update, and we'll have some time to share with each other. So, but in the meantime, you all are on mute, and if so, when you do have a question, you don't even have to wait till the end of Kathy's presentation. You can start putting it in the chat box, and we'll try to get as many questions in as we can. So again, thank you for being with us this afternoon, and I'd now like to turn it over to Kathy.
Well, good afternoon to all of you. Reverend Bob Moore, thank you very, very much for your welcome and your introduction. And Joe, thank you for outreach, and Nikki for coordinating this as well. And I'm so very, very grateful to be part of a gathering that's doing something I believe is so vitally necessary amongst interfaith groups all across the United States. I want to go back in history quite a bit to tell you about a time when I honestly never thought about a drone and couldn't make connections. I knew so little. I was in Lebanon, and this was 2006. It sometimes is referred to as the Israeli-Hezbollah war. And it was a terrible war during which, particularly south of a river called the Litani River, people were being hit by Israeli warplanes while Hezbollah was hitting Israel, and they were caught and they were trapped, and some were trying to escape. And a group in Beirut, who I guess you'd refer to them as sort of like, we used to say yuppies. They were landscapers and translators and social workers, English teachers. they put out a call for internationals to accompany them because they had determined to form a convoy of cars, and in the trunk of every car would be supplies that they would try to bring to the people that were trapped in the south of Lebanon while the war was still going on. So, you know, they thought if they had internationals accompanying them, maybe they'd be a little less endangered. So a number of people turned up, and I was among them with 3 close friends. And we were stopped. We weren't able to go where we had wanted to go. But then a ceasefire was signed a few days later. And so 2 young men, both named Mohammed, said, well, our parents have summer homes in that area and we have a car. We'll take you there if you want to try to see the damage. And we had actually had a list from a professor at DePaul, Norman Finkelstein, DePaul University in Chicago, of what he thought might be massacres that had occurred over the course of this war. And so we had that list in our spiral notebooks, and there we were. And we went to a place called Hana. In Christian scripture, you hear about the wedding feast at Cana, and it might have been a similar area. And at Hana, we could see on the outskirts while driving that workers were preparing rectangular cement structures that would be used to bury people. And then we, on foot, turned around a corner and we saw more workers setting up white plastic chairs in front of 2 different dwellings, one for women, one for men. So and I headed over toward the women. And we honestly were too challenged by language to understand some of what was going on, but some things were very clear. There was a woman wearing a thick neck brace and a medical hood. And as women came, they were embracing her and offering condolence. And you see, this was the first that people could actually hold funerals safely and have exhumed the bodies. And as it had happened, during this war, on July 30th at 1 o'clock in the morning, a warplane, an Israeli warplane, had hit a particular structure that was being used by 3 extended families. And because the engineers in the area said this one is the safest possible, children were sent there from the extended families while their parents stayed outside in their own homes. And the structure that had been hit was right across the street. And the woman, her name was Zainab, her 6-year-old daughter had been killed. And Zainab moved with difficulty. She had a tall, thin body, and she just kind of shifted, and she couldn't really point across the street, but she was trying to point up above. And she was then asking Farah and me, didn't they know? Didn't they see? And I really didn't know who they referred to. It was later when I started to realize that drones were still crisscrossing the skies. You could hear the buzz, that she meant, didn't the people operating those drones know that there were children in the building, that her Zainab would run from the building in the morning back into her arms and she would feed her daughter breakfast. And she told us that Zainab loved to study her English words, and then that brought a torrent of agony and sobs, and she said she loved her English. And then her son was sent to fetch newspapers, and there were photos which we'd actually seen before because cab drivers had taped them on the doors of their cars. Photos of a helmeted relief worker holding aloft the lifeless body of her child, Zainab. And another photo of 2 little girls cuddled in each other's arms, and their bodies were immaculate. What killed those 2 little girls, Zahra, age 2, Zainab, age 6, was that the force of the explosion imploded their internal organs. And we had heard that then Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice had said to the Israelis, don't sign a ceasefire, we'll get you the bunker buster that Raytheon had just perfected. And so the witnesses had told people that it was as though the house lifted out off, the explosion came from underneath, and then the house collapsed on top of the people. and 23 people, Human Rights Watch later reported, were killed. But for Zainab, her question that she clearly wanted us to understand had to do with whether or not the people in the drone, who operated the drones, knew. Didn't they know? Didn't they see? And then her son brought her a picture, and it was a framed photo of Zainab with tousled hair and big eyes, and you could just imagine a smile spreading across her very serious face. And the mother tapped the plastic over the picture, and she said, "Who is the terrorist? Is she the terrorist?" And I think the terror of the drones is that the people who are being under surveillance 24/7 know that the people operating those surveillance drones are capable of killing their children. And that is very terrifying. I didn't really think much more about drones, but then in 2009, a number of us recognized we really didn't know much about 21st century military. And so we traveled to Pakistan. We went to the city of Islamabad, and we were able to meet with a Muslim imam who was trying very hard to bring together Christian and Muslim and different adherence to different practices within Islam. He wanted to bring people together for dialogue. And so we asked him, could he help us form a dialogue with somebody who had been affected by a drone strike? And he knew of a village in a remote area. The village was called Khassor. It's near Waziristan in the north of Pakistan. And he said he would do his best. And so the man walked a long distance because there weren't any roads leading into his own home. And then he took 2 buses and he sat and met with us. And he told about a bombing that had happened on May 20th of 2009. And in that area, where there aren't roads and not much along the line of shops, if someone knocks on your door, the code is you open the door, and if the person wants food or the person wants a beverage, you serve the person. And this is a very, very old custom. I think of people familiar with the New Testament story of Jesus sending the disciples out in 2s, and he said, take nothing for the journey. And some think, well, maybe that was intended to kind of test, are the householders abiding by this custom or not? And so the elders in the village, whose home had been approached by people who may have been insurgent fighters, gave food and drink, and the insurgent fighters were long gone. And at 4:30 in the morning, that home was hit. It's estimated that there were 14 women and children who were killed, and also 2 of the village elders. And, you know, because there are no roads, the man said that they had to try to go through the open fields carrying the bodies of maimed and wounded survivors, and they didn't have any first aid. The only thing they could do is take their scarves and wrap them around as tourniquets. And then when they tried to flag down a car didn't stop. And then another stopped and heard what happened and kept going. And that would never be normal for them. They believed in hospitality and mutual help. But you see, once an attack would happen, people would fear there would be a second attack. And I asked the man, do you think people in your village would ever sit down with people from my part of the world? And he looked at me. He said, well, anybody in our village would think that was a crazy question. Of course we would sit down. Who would not want to talk about peace? He said, just we would ask you to leave your weapons outside. So I think about the ensuing 10 years since that 2009 conversation, and there's been tremendous proliferation. We haven't left the weapons outside. We've developed more and more sophisticated weapons. And then, although I heard not a word in those conversations of desire for revenge or retaliation. I think it's not surprising that groups that have been hit by these weapons again and again and again do start to recruit people to join together and say, well, we have to stop this. We have to get what we have to, lay our hands on some weapons. So, I mean, at this point, the proliferation is so enormous that, how we talk about how the nuclear energy programs kind of feed the nuclear weapon programs, nuclear power plants. Okay, but what about nuclear weapons? Well, now the drone industry, the commercial drone industry, they may be flying over all of our houses right now, dropping off products and, taking photos. And it seems, pretty innocuous, but that now creates a shelter in a sense for and feeds the weaponized drone industry, if you will. And that's becoming more and more serious because people figure out ways to export further, and they figure out ways to make things more accessible. And so now, for instance, in Yemen, where the world's worst humanitarian crisis is unfolding, the Ansar Allah, sometimes called the Houthi, have initially they were using just drone hobby kits and rigging them up to carry some explosives that were being used against the Saudis across the border. And the Saudis then, of course, intensified their bombing, and then the Houthis began to get more sophisticated drones, so that, it's really become a situation of spiraling, escalating warfare, while people in Yemen are at risk of famine conditions. And most people don't really know very much about these kinds of consequences. And we also find that along with proliferation, there's a profit motive. I could mention, for instance, that one of the wealthiest people in the world, and certainly in the United States, is a man named Neil Blue, and he is the chief executive officer for General Atomics. Most recently, he was said to have a net worth of $3.3 billion. And previously, before COVID, he and his family had a net worth of $4.1 billion. Well, General Atomics is a major producer of the drones. And, I think maybe closer to home for those of you in North Carolina, I know that in Asheville, North Carolina, Raytheon Corporation is now planning to start digging foundations to build a structure to make weapons there. And, who knows if they may not be interacting with people who produce the drones. So it becomes very much part of our everyday life. And when it's jobs, 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 it's right back to that old problem. When you have corporate profits and government jobs intertwined, whether it's the military industrial complex, the prison industrial complex, it's very difficult to uproot those entrenched systems. And so even though so many religious faiths share the question Isaiah asked, is not this the fast that I desire, that you share your bread with the homeless poor, that you look out for the widows and orphans? Our weapons create more widows, more orphans, more hunger, and less understanding. And this is one of the things that's so ironic, because, we're told that the drones used for surveillance are trying to establish patterns of life by, collecting miles and miles of footage that people who are analysts can then pore over, and they can know more about patterns of life. Well, for one thing, hideous mistakes are made. One big mistake was made. It was written up in the Los Angeles Times, and again recently referred to in the London Review of Books in an article in the chat by Andrew Coburn. There were people who were going to visit relatives in Kabul. They were going to get medical care, and the drone was focusing on this convoy, thinking these might be Taliban, and then they focused on something that so many people inside one of the cars seemed to be holding, and they thought these must be guns, and they turned out to be turkeys. that the convoy members were bringing as gifts to their family members in Kabul, Afghanistan. Well, mistakes are made again and again. I'm thinking about September 17th, 2019, a little over a year ago. A man who owned a big pine nut field in the Wazir Tangi area of the Nangarhar province of Afghanistan needed to harvest the pine nuts. And so he had sent a letter to the US forces, to people he thought could reach Talib forces, to the NATO forces, and to the UN, saying about 150 migrant workers will gather and encamp outside my field. And he told the dates, and they'll just be harvesting the pine nuts. Well, they had worked hard, the 150 or so workers, and they brought their children with them because that's what people do when they can get work in a desperate area, very, very remote spot. And a United States drone operated by a base. I've tried hard to find out which base or to learn more about the US messages with regard to this, but the drone attacked the pine nut harvesters. They had finished their workday, they had built fires, they were settling down to have tea and then take their rest under blankets, and the drone missile ripped through that encampment and it killed 32 people. And there were about 40 survivors. Now, can you imagine if you survive an attack like that, but your arm is broken or a limb has been ripped off? There's no ambulance. There aren't any first aid stations nearby. There aren't tourniquets. There aren't going to be pain relievers. There's not going to be surgery easily available. And if you do get a surgery, you're not going to have clean bandages and physical therapy and x-rays and walkers and all of the things to which we're accustomed. And your name won't even be mentioned if you were killed. And increasingly, the United States has shielded the military and the CIA and any other agencies that are authorized to use drones from any kind of scrutiny, because they're not required any longer to give that crucial information. So, it becomes very difficult to know how many people are killed by drones, but or maimed or wounded or displaced. But I do know that, for instance, in Afghanistan, the young people I know, they do surveillance. And their surveillance involves a spiral pad and a pen. And they bundle up in the cold weather and they walk up the mountainside where there aren't really even any paths, and it's kind of slippy, and I felt it was a bit treacherous myself. And then they go into the huts, the hovels of widows who, I remember a woman named Khorab was just shelling almonds constantly while she spoke with us. And we had to duck into her hut because I had actually started to grow faint. It was such a difficult hike. And so I'm lying on her pillow and she's shelling the almonds and putting the shells into the bukhari, her small oven, because that's how she'll have heat. And then she would bag up the almonds and send a supply down to the marketplace with her very young son, because that's how they got income to try to pay the rent. And the higher up you go, the less expensive it is because it's more difficult to get water. There's no running water, and she'd have to go out or get her child to go out to fetch the water and then carry it back up the mountainside. Well, these are the kinds of surveys. That's the surveillance that's crucial to understand. And my young friends would ask very sensitive questions. How often does this family eat beans? Nobody has meat. How do you pay the rent? And if the answer to that question is that a child laborer brings in the income, then that sheet went to the top of their pile. And those are the people they would most try to help through a street kids school project and a blanket making project. Well, that's surveillance we need. But all the time in Kabul, every time I've ever been there, there were 4 big, huge blimps with cameras spying on people and drones all the time. And everybody knows those drones are up there and that they could be followed by weaponized drones and that you are at risk. But this isn't something that we know so easily here. And so I want to end my time with you for speaking by recalling words from the Korean War, actually. And they were quoted in a story called Lark and Termite, a novel by Jane Ann Phillips. And Jane Ann Phillips has her main character who's weary of war. He wants to go home. He's sick of war. And he looks at a warplane and he says, "The planes always come, like planets on rotation, a timed bloodletting with different excuses." I'll just say that again. The planes always come, like planets on rotation, a timed bloodletting with different excuses. But we know there is no excuse. I think about the covenant virtues of chesed and tzedakah and emet, of merciful love, of justice, of truth. And you can't square those virtues bequeathed to communities for centuries. You can't square them with an operator in a dimly lit trailer watching footage that's 7,000 miles away in one sense, and maybe 17 inches away in another sense, and being told by someone up the chain, the kill chain, okay, now, impact. And then that person possibly is killing or maiming civilians who are no threat whatsoever to him, her, his or her family, your or my loved ones. But then it creates, well, a greater recruitment now for insurgent groups than Guantanamo once created. I hope that's making sense. I mean, people used to say that the stories that emerged from Guantanamo actually drew more people into insurgent groups. And now the stories that emerge from the drone attacks actually work to recruit people into insurgent groups. So I do want to say that wonderful actions are happening across the country. Outside of Volk Field in Wisconsin, near Mauston, Wisconsin, people have launched a campaign that says, "Feed people, not drones." And they're asking people to give the equivalent of what might be given to spending money on drones to spending money on people whose needs for food locally in Wisconsin aren't being met. And people outside of Hancock Field in Syracuse, upstate New York, are constantly doing very, very creative actions to draw attention. And once a number of us did an action at Creech Air Force Base, we believe you have to bring these realities before the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branches of government. And one way to go in front of the judicial branch is to, be part of a dramatic action. So we fasted for 12 days and then we crossed the line. And the judge, quite unusually, allowed expert testimony, allowed Ramsey Clark and Bill Quigley and Ann Wright to testify. And then he said, I need 4 months to think about this. Normally you're sentenced pretty soon after your trial out there in Nevada for a small level offense, but he took 4 months. He found us guilty, but still he took 4 months to think about it. So I think, we can collectively join together and bring these vital and important issues further into the consciousness. And Joe Biden is right now pledged to possibly put Averill Haines, who was one of the ones who picked out high-value targets for the Obama administration into a high-level cabinet position. And he has said, well, I will pursue war in Afghanistan with special operations. And those so often involve drones. And we ought not kid ourselves that that won't possibly nullify any agreements that have been made, because the Taliban will say, you know, up with this, we will not put. So thank you for listening to all of this. I certainly welcome your questions, and please don't hesitate to write to me if something occurs to you later, or if you think I might have any research that would help you with people in your communities, or with preparing a talk you might be giving about drones. I'll just type my my email into the chat.
Great. Thank you so much, Kathy. We really appreciate it. And we're open for questions. Now, I prefer, just because I can't even see everybody at once, because we're over 30 people right now, that we use the chat box. So if you do have a question, Nikki, if you can help me monitor that, please type it into the chat box. And that's the most orderly way to do questions. But while we're waiting for somebody to put a question in there, I'm wondering, one of the people in our midst today couldn't make it actually to the drone conference that we had at Princeton Seminary that sort of launched this educational outreach effort. He was abroad, but Richard Moody is a former fighter pilot for both the US and the Royal Navy. Richard, I know you've been doing a lot of research. You've come with us many times to the protests against drone warfare in Horsham, Pennsylvania, at the drone base there. Richard, do you have any comments to start us out with while we're waiting for some people to post questions for us?
I believe Richard had to leave early.
Oh, he had to leave early. Well, that's too bad. If you want to try raising your hand and asking it verbally, I'll recognize you, and you know, just try to be as brief as you can. But again, you don't have to wait for anything if you want to post a question in the chat box. I really appreciate the depth of what Kathy presented to us. And while we're also waiting, let me just mention that one of the things that was shared out among a number of us was a recent article from the Washington Post that really underlined what Kathy was saying about the rapid escalation of drone warfare, the normalization of it. And that is that in the Azerbaijan-Armenia war recently, Azerbaijan ultimately won quite handily despite not having its own air force. And the reason it didn't need to have that sort of very expensive, time-consuming aspect to be able to fight and win that military engagement was that it bought drones from Israel and Turkey. And so 80 countries have weaponized drones now. This is really has escalated so rapidly. And so it's very, very sobering. In one of our educational videos that I mentioned at the outset, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, the former chief of staff to Colin Powell, said that it's just a matter of time until this comes back to bite us right here on our home territory. And so we've got to find ways to get restraint and to start de-escalating the drone warfare that we've been escalating for many years now. Who has a question or a comment? Raise your hand and or just unmute yourself for that matter. I don't see people stampeding. Joe, you should have the right of making the first comment or question, Joe. You did so much work to help make this gathering happen. Joe Burton? Oh. Okay, and somebody just posted the article that I mentioned, and thank you for that.
Yeah, I recall that you talked a little bit about Raytheon in the Chicago area. Kathy. Am I remembering correctly or?
Joe, actually, I was talking about Raytheon breaking ground in
Asheville, right.
Asheville, North Carolina. My friend Ken Jones said that they're going to try to bring the issues in front of the county commissioners and, you know, start to raise questions. So I'm sure that they'll be looking for allies. I don't know to what extent Raytheon relies on drone technology, but there are many, many instances of Raytheon having directly hit civilians. I think some of you might know about the instance in Yemen where there were school children on a bus with their blue backpacks that had just been issued by UNICEF. And oh, I'm sorry, that was a Lockheed Martin missile that hit the school bus. But Raytheon is written up in a very compelling article by Jeffrey Stern in the New York Times because of a missile that they fired on people who were digging a well, just digging a well. And you know, the person Jeffrey Stern interviewed talked about, he had Jeffrey Stern feel his face, and fragments of the missile were actually, you know, embedded in his cheekbone and his forehead. And that missile was made by Raytheon at its Arizona factory. So, you know, people think they have intelligence about who it is that's going to be hit by the weaponry, but again and again and again, they're wrong. And I noticed that Ken Lundgren has mentioned President Obama's book, The Promised Land, and he goes to great pains to justify, apparently, his decision to use drone strikes. He felt that there were young kids who were so angry and they grow up and they might become insurgents, and something had to be done because they would pose a threat to the security of the United States. But, you know, I think we ought to ask, well, then what do we do about statistics that show that since the United States began the war on terror, when it invaded and bombed Afghanistan, the incidences of terrorist actions have multiplied dramatically. And in fact, you know, throughout all of our forever wars, we haven't put a stop to terrorism. It's become more and more of a problem. And, you know, groups kind of rehack themselves. You know, there might be Al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula, or the Islamic State in the Khorasan province. But essentially, people are desperate for food. They're hungry. They want to feed their families. And the only jobs available quite often are working for the military. I mean, we know some of that in our own country. And so people don't really want to pick up a gun all that badly. They may not really have an ideology that's in sync with any of the groups, but that's who's hiring. And so the more that we put our technology and our energy and our interest into militarization, the more we sort of jettison the other tools in the toolkit. And those are the ones that are so needed. That's why I so admire my young friends in Afghanistan, because they get what is needed and they try to find ways relationally to meet those kinds of needs.
So building on that, Kathy, I see H.A. Penner has a question. He's one of the anchors of our monthly protests at Horsham, Pennsylvania, at the base there. What can we anticipate regarding drone warfare in the Biden-Harris administration, and how can we best relate to those developments?
Well, thank you, H.A. Penner. I'm certainly always encouraged by memory of having been with you and your colleagues. I think it's important to get in touch with the Biden transition team. You can go to Biden's website and there's a, you know, scroll around and you'll find a section where you can at least enter into a box what your concerns are and say that you don't believe special operations are a reliable way to begin to develop peaceable settings. And I think that with the special operations will come the analysis of drone footage acquired through drone surveillance. But that I think it's far more important to ask groups like Oxfam and Jesuit Refugee Services and International Commission of the Red Cross, or in Afghanistan, for instance, the Emergency Surgical Centers for Victims of War. Examine their reports and try to see what they're saying about the assessments of needs. And don't rely on warlords, because the warlords are always going to be in competition with each other and fooling people deliberately. And unfortunately, the United States are, really regarded as one of the most well-heeled and menacing of all the warlords in a place like Afghanistan. And I think it's very important to challenge President Obama to show how it is that he believes security was enhanced. And we can't even get the information about the consequences of those strikes and attacks. And as I say, they're even more shielded, they're even more secretive now. But one thing you can get is the Special Inspector General on Afghan Reconstruction reports. Another one was just filed very recently. And those reports show fraud and waste and corruption. So our special operations that are very, very secretive and despised, hated in provinces all across Afghanistan, are those ways that we could count on building more security. I think our security is founded in fair and friendly relationships. I know this deviates a bit from the issue of drones, but I would strongly suggest emphasizing that the United States should immediately seek a multinational fund into which countries could pour monies equivalent to what they poured into war making for actually rebuilding Afghanistan, and seek a multinational peacekeeping presence, which would not be reliant on the NATO countries, but rather seek other countries for leadership, and seek immediately, and maybe use drones for this, to find all the places where landmines and other ordnance have been strewn across Afghanistan and clear out those hideous weapons.
And speaking of landmines, that triggers, I think we also need to be mindful of signs of hope, and certainly the landmines ban, which was spearheaded by Nobel laureate and a citizen initiative. The Ottawa Treaty is really a great example of how we can curtail these weapons. It's not necessarily a hopeless struggle.
I'm so glad you said that.
Pardon me?
Well, I was sort of wanting to add to that on January 22nd, the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons will be officially ratified. And that's the day when there should be dancing in the streets and great, great hope. And you're right, eventually landmines are no longer the norm. It doesn't mean that some groups don't still get them secondhand, or, they make their own. But eventually the Treaty for Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons insists that any country that ratifies can't engage in procurement, research, transportation, inducement. In Ireland, you could be punished with life in prison if you are involved in any kind of creation of or inducement of creating nuclear weapons. So that's really a new world we'll be looking at.
That's right. And so that's the ban treaty. The nuclear ban treaty builds on the success and the example, really, of the landmines ban treaty, which the U.S. hasn't signed even to this day, but still is cooperating with in terms of trying to dismantle some of the landmines and so on. So it's gaining legitimacy. And as you said, Kathy, the 50th country did ratify, and therefore the nuclear ban treaty enters into force 90 days from then, which is January 22. By the way, we're going to be having a program about that for any of you who would like to join us on December 16th at 7 p.m. that evening, and it's going to feature the UN representative for ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. And he was he was key in getting those 50 countries to ratify and getting us to this stage. So check us out at peacecoalition.org, and we would love to have you join us that evening. It's going to be a celebration, and I agree with you, Kathy. It's something to dance in the streets about, but we'll at least put up a toast and hear more about how it happened and what the next steps are. We're very proud as well that right here in Princeton, the scientific advisor to that negotiation, Dr. Zia Mian, is a physicist right here at Princeton University, and we work very closely with him and his program on science and global security. So that's a hopeful note, I think, to wrap up Kathy's presentation. And let's show Kathy our appreciation